A crowd of 54,000 at Seattle's Safeco Field is witnessing professional wrestling history, though most don't seem to realize it. To the expansive audience, it's a showdown between two industrial icons that have done battle many times before. The men inside that ring have a firmer grasp of the significance, particularly this man, Stone Cold Steve Austin. At 38 years of age, with a ravaged spinal column and two equally deteriorating knees, the vanguard of WWE's Attitude Era is getting ready to turn out the lights on his career, 13 and a half years after it began. Historically, Austin has been the master of the authoritative answer, but over the previous year, there's been far too many troubling questions about Austin's mindset, his health, his relationships, and his future. Stone Cold starred in WWE's latest boom period, but now there doesn't seem to be much of a role for him going forward. Austin knows this match is likely the end and is resigned to this fate. But standing across the ring from him is the only latter-day wrestling star of his lofty caliber, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He too has a questionable future in WWE. The tall and muscular Brahma Bull has been more than flirting with life away from the squared circle. In fact, he's full-on embracing the bright lights of Tinseltown. At age 30, perhaps the biggest star in the wrestling sky has found a greater calling elsewhere in the universe, and his days inside this niche galaxy are clearly numbered. The showdown in Seattle is hardly the first brush Rock has had with Austin, as their paths had crossed numerous times over the previous 6 years. On many of those occasions, history in some form was made. No matter where their lives have taken them since, the two wrestling icons have remained perpetually intertwined, dually synonymous with a specific period of time and their historic encounters within. But their most historic encounter, that one took place on March 30th, 2003. Even if most of us beyond the guardrails didn't grasp it in the moment. It was the end of an era, and it was the end of their era. But before they could close the book, they had to have just one more fight. To get why this match is so important, we have to understand why these two men themselves are so important. And for that, we're going to need a lot of context. Like, a lot of context. First, we need to go all the way back to the autumn of 1995. See, back then, both men were at a crossroads. The sort of crossroads where future WrestleMania main eventer several times over seemed like a pipe dream. Of the two, the one with seemingly better odds of headlining Mania at the time was Austin. Austin wasn't yet Stone Cold, though his wrestling career at the time could be fairly described as ice cold. He had spent the previous 4 years in WCW, where his general greatness quickly became evident. After all, he won the television title just days into his debut. Not many 26-year-olds with less than 2 years of ring experience are given that sort of faith. And it wasn't blind faith either. Over the next few years, Austin collected secondary titles and made his mark in famous partnerships like the Dangerous Alliance and the Hollywood Blondes. Stunning Steve was a bright spot in the sometimes uneven number 2 company. Austin reminded some of a younger Ric Flair. Cocky, confident, charismatic, and with a keen sense of timing inside the ring. But after so much spotlighting, over his final year in WCW, Austin mostly found himself in the dark. He was phased down the card during the Hoganization of WCW, aced out during a very Hulkster-influenced roster turnover. I mean, when you're dropping the US title to 40-year-old hacksaw Jim Duggan in about 30 seconds on pay-per-view, you're probably not in line to be Hogan's next challenger. And if counterproductive booking weren't enough, Austin was also racked with injuries. He blew out his knee in the autumn of 1994, then tore his triceps during a tour of New Japan the following spring. The injury bug had dug deep into Austin, now 30 years old, and theoretically entering his prime years. And now, if Austin resumed his career, he was going to have to do so for a different company. In September of 1995, WCW Vice President Eric Bischoff fired Austin, reportedly due to Austin choosing to no-show a TV taping at which he was scheduled to cut promos. Today, that executive decision is viewed with incredulousness. But on the primitive interwebs of 1995, it was more like, man, what a waste of good talent, with minimal extreme outrage. At the time of Austin's firing, he was still overcoming his arm injury, and had few substantial employment options. The WWF had been in heavy downsize mode throughout 1995, and while they could certainly use someone like Austin to shore up their weakest roster ever, nothing was guaranteed. So, for a time, Austin turned up in ECW, where he quickly set about mocking Bischoff and Hogan through inspired parodies while hanging close to the world title picture. Around the time Austin was working out those job-related frustrations in South Philly, a fellow blue-chip talent was headed home from Canada, feeling more than a little dejected. 23-year-old Dwayne Johnson had also just lost his job, getting cut from the Calgary Stampeders of the Canadian Football League. In college, Johnson played defensive line for the Miami Hurricanes that won the 1991 National Championship, though he was mostly a backup, rotating in when star players like future Hall of Famer Warren Sapp needed a breather. Johnson had dreams of one day playing in the NFL. However, an injury-riddled 1994 season diminished his visibility and hindered his output. Come the 1995 draft, none of the NFL's then 30 teams were willing to take a chance on a rotational player, especially one recovering from herniated discs. Instead, he spent a couple of months north of the border on Calgary's practice squad before getting unceremoniously cut. And that pretty much killed his gridiron dream dead. A near-destitute Johnson brooded over this sudden dead end for a few weeks before turning to the family business: professional wrestling. In addition to being part of the prolific Anoa'i bloodline, Johnson had a wrestling father in former WWF Tag Team Champion Rocky Soulman Johnson. While the elder Johnson had fostered future wrestlers before, he was hesitant to train his son, knowing just how unfulfilling the wrestling business could be. Like any father, he wanted better for his kid. Nonetheless, Dwayne Johnson was dead set on giving wrestling a serious try, and with enough convincing, Rocky finally agreed to help him. With further aid from Pat Patterson and Dr. Tom Pritchard, yet another ex-football prospect was going to learn the ropes. Wrestling under his real name, Johnson had his first bout at a WWF Superstars taping in Corpus Christi, Texas in March of 1996, defeating the Brooklyn Brawler in a dark match. It's a historic footnote today, but hardly a head-turner at the time. To demonstrate just how inauspicious Johnson's debut was, in the Wrestling Observer's write-up of the event, Dave Meltzer wasn't even sure what Johnson's first name was. Attendees that sent in reports to the Observer apparently misheard the ring announcer, as some reports called him Dwayne and others Craig. Even Meltzer, who knows a thing or two about the Anoa'i family, didn't put the pieces together at the time that this was Rocky Johnson's son debuting. Not exactly a stirring beginning for Dwayne, or Craig. At the time the People's Craig was laying that rudimentary smackdown on the Brawler, Austin was by then making a go of it in the then WWF. Coincidentally, at that very same TV taping in Corpus Christi, Austin took on a handle that would positively shape his professional destiny. And that was a good thing, because his previous moniker was destined for the scrap heap of infamy. By the end of 1995, Austin had joined the WWF after both Kevin Nash and Jim Ross advocated for his hiring. The WWF that awaited Austin had been derided for being overly cartoonish. The Fed's new generation led many critics to dismiss the ailing promotion as a tone-deaf circus. And what does every circus need? A ringmaster, of course. True to the Stamford method of painting over recognizable wrestlers, Stunning Steve morphed into the Ringmaster. While he was spared the top hat and coattails, Austin was nearly unrecognizable as this master of the ring, wearing plain green trunks with little to no frills otherwise, save for the $1 million belt that was gifted upon arrival. He also barely spoke, as manager Ted DiBiase did the talking for Austin, who was presented as a robotic near-mute. Group all of these features with the fact that Austin chopped off his receding blonde hair during his ECW stint, and this didn't resemble that young star destined for many brushes with greatness. And for a few months, Austin kinda just moseyed around the mid-card, playing this soulless wrestling machine constructed in some lab. But as Austin entered into a WrestleMania 12 rivalry with Savio Vega, he received a character upgrade through two unlikely inspirations. First, he'd watched a documentary on contract killer Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, which provided the foundation for what Austin wanted to portray as a character. The cold-blooded nature of Kuklinski, not the murdering part. The other inspiration, as the legend goes, came when then-wife Jeannie brought Austin some tea one night and casually said to drink it before it got stone cold. And that's how, on March 10th, 1996, Austin appeared for the first time as Stone Cold Steve Austin, defeating Aldo Montoya at the same Superstars tapings. With his head now fully shaved and sporting a gruff goatee, Austin was even farther removed from his days in WCW's upper mid-card. But unlike with the Ringmaster, this path seemed to have greater potential. And that path did bear fruit, though not always by conscious design. Austin won the 1996 King of the Ring tournament, albeit as a backup choice when intended winner Hunter Hearst Helmsley was punished for his part in the Click's curtain call at Madison Square Garden. Around the same time, Austin picked up a new finish. At the recommendation of Michael Hayes, Austin traded in DiBiase's $1 million dream for a sit-down variant of the Ace Crusher, which Hayes' Freebird partner Jimmy Garvin had used in WCW 2 years earlier. The Stone Cold Stunner was born. Reborn was Austin's speaking voice as DiBiase left the WWF that May. Now solo, Austin was henceforth entrusted to cut his own promos and replaced the labored monotone with his fiery Texas drawl. And speak Austin did after he defeated Jake Roberts to win the King of the Ring. Taunting the wounded Snake as he was helped away, Austin subverted Roberts' outspoken faith when he bellowed, "Talk about your Psalms, talk about John 3:16, Austin 3:16 says I just whipped your ass." A new name, a statement win, a new finisher, permission to speak, and an unscripted $1 million catchphrase. All of this came to Austin within a 3-month stretch. And this was before Austin acquired the Rage Against the Machine inspired entrance music, complete with timeless glass-breaking drop. Suddenly, Austin was the coolest guy on the WWF roster, becoming a valuable weapon at a time when the WWF was losing stars and struggling to create new ones. It didn't take long for the WWF to match this Austin up against a returning hero in Bret Hart, the battleground being the 1996 Survivor Series in New York City. Within those hallowed halls of Madison Square Garden, legends were often made. And it was there that another legend got his official start. Johnson had spent a few months sharpening his skills in the fading Memphis territory under the curious ring name of Flex Kavana, which he admits he picked out himself. His next ring name was chosen for him, and it wasn't one he was especially keen on. Rocky Maivia was a mashup of Johnson's wrestling forebears, grandfather High Chief Peter Maivia and father Rocky Johnson. The future Rock was more interested in forging his own unique identity, but the WWF brass insisted on pushing him as a smiling do-gooder that wanted to honor his family. In fact, Johnson was specifically told that he couldn't smile enough. This, while the NWO was raising hell on the other channel and rabble-rousing Austin was becoming the hottest thing in the WWF. Shallow as that character was, it did come equipped with an immediate push, as Maivia was the sole survivor of an 8-man elimination match inside the Garden, last eliminating veterans Crush and Goldust. That was Maivia's televised in-ring debut. Save for palling around with his assigned teammates in the weeks beforehand, the WWF hadn't really done much to properly introduce Maivia to its mystified audience. But the push continued. Maivia pinned Helmsley to win the Intercontinental title on a February 1997 Raw and retained it over the Sultan, his miscast cousin Rikishi, at WrestleMania 13 in Chicago. All the while, this Rocky Maivia had the depth of a milk saucer, and fan sentiment ranged from extreme disinterest to outright hostility. They cheered loudly when Maivia lost the title to Owen Hart, and chants of Rocky sucks were audible at arenas, with Johnson personally estimating that it would be a quarter of the building some nights and half of it others. With that sort of regular rebuke, it was perhaps serendipitous that Maivia blew out his knee while wrestling Mankind that May. The injury would sideline Johnson for close to 3 months, but it gave him the chance to return fresh with a new angle. Just before Johnson staged that comeback, Austin found himself sidelined as well, and his prognosis was considerably more grim. 1997 looked to be Austin's year. After losing a heated encounter to Bret Hart at the 1996 Survivor Series, he went on to win the 1997 Royal Rumble through dubious means, last throwing out the Hitman after the referees missed his own elimination. The rivalry between Austin and Hart signified a shift in fan sentiment. Hart's now routine cries of injustice were still mostly met with cheers, though an undercurrent of boos was beginning to seep in. And for Austin, his anti-hero one-man army shtick made him a cool heel, which was a blessing in that at least somebody in late-stage New Generation was considered cool by the audience. With the changing tides came plans for a double turn, though hindsight shows that turning Bret heel may have been a calculated move by McMahon to diminish Bret's value before, trying to breach his massive contract. Turning Austin face made perfect sense. Austin 316 shirts were selling in droves, as Stone Cold was the perfect remedy for 3 years of New Generation tedium. And so, at WrestleMania 13 in Chicago, in what some consider the greatest bout in WWE history, Austin lost a submission match to Hart, famously passing out to Bret's sharpshooter while practically drowning in his own blood. The refusal to surrender only enhanced Austin to the wide-eyed audience, while Bret's post-match actions cast him as a frustrated, sore winner. Though nominally a babyface, Austin wasn't trying to charm the audience through some character modification. He still flipped the double bird, except now those fingers were directed at the WWF's resident villains. One villain was Owen Hart, the Intercontinental Champion and veritable deputy of Brother Bret's reformed Hart Foundation. Austin and Owen met at the 1997 SummerSlam in what seemed like a sure win for Stone Cold to net him his first singles belt in the WWF. But then, in the blink of an eye, Austin's golden run hit an unthinkable roadblock. Hoisting Austin into an upside-down position, Owen performed a seated tombstone piledriver that spiked Austin squarely on his head. The impact temporarily paralyzed Austin, damaging his C4 and C5 vertebrae. The match ground to a halt, and eventually went into an improvised finish, where a clearly hampered Austin rolled Owen up in a minimalist pinning predicament to win the title. Though doctors recommended retirement, Austin wasn't so inclined. He had never been this close to pro wrestling's apex, and he wasn't quitting now. For the next 3 or 4 months, Austin barely wrestled, but instead made appearances to give out stunners to whomever was pissing him off at the time. Jim Ross, Jerry Lawler, Sergeant Slaughter, and Owen himself all fell to the stunner, keeping Austin fresh and interesting to an audience that was increasingly gaga for him. The grand poobah of these stunners was the one he gave to still babyface announcer Vince on a September 1997 Raw. Clearly, thousands of New Yorkers at MSG enjoyed the sight of McMahon taking a stunner from Austin. Austin did return to the ring shortly thereafter, but for a time, his matches were kept short. The injury also led to a change in in-ring style, as the gifted wrestler/brawler now emphasized the brawling element more, relying less on bumps and more upon frenetic ringside spanning slugfests that weren't so taxing. Inadvertently, Austin's spinal injury created the new WWF main event style, the chaotic walk and brawls that would define the Attitude Era. Arguably, the Stone Cold formula was crystallized by the end of 1997, thanks in no small part to an in-ring accident. It was in one of those short skirmishes at the infamous 1997 Survivor Series that Austin regained the IC title from Owen. His next notable title match would also be a short bout, and a pretty memorable one at that. His challenger was Rocky Maivia, but not the Rocky Maivia that fans previously saw. Shortly after Austin's injury, Maivia returned to the fold without any build-up. He just randomly intervened on a match between Farouk and DOA member Chains, and then swiftly planted Chains with the move we'd come to know as the Rock Bottom, a clear upgrade over his milquetoast shoulder breaker finish. The intrusion marked Maivia's admittance into Farouk's nation of domination. This gave Maivia license to stop smiling, to cycle through some more spiteful expressions. It also allowed him to abandon the cookie-cutter promos he'd sporadically recited, and instead speak with a little more venom. Johnson had used his injury layoff time well. He had taken acting classes to improve his promo work, so not only was this heel turn beneficial, but it gave him a chance to show off his sharpened skill set. At first, the changes were gradual. Maivia was little more than the most athletic-looking guy in a group of brooding heavyweights, but at least the Rocky Sucks chants were appropriate now for the character. After Survivor Series, Maivia entered into a feud with new IC champion Austin. On the surface, this felt like your typical mini-feud for the new babyface title holder. A month-long arc where the protagonist wins and then moves on to a new challenge. Instead, it was the catalyst for 2 eventual cornerstones leveling up. There was some inspired build here. Maivia, now being called The Rock more and more, stole the IC belt. Austin taunted him by getting the production team to flash Rocky Sucks on the Titantron so that the crowd could chant along. And eventually, Austin and Rock's brewing rivalry came to a head at the December In Your House. The match wasn't really a match so much as it was a whirlwind of collateral damage. Austin drove his black pickup truck to the ring, beat up all the Nation members, backdrop poor D'Lo Brown onto the windshield, and gave him the stunner on top of the cab. Back inside the ring, Austin, still wearing his leather vest, pinned Rock with the stunner. The entire melee lasted just 5.5 minutes, and the crowd was hooked for its duration. It was easily the best part of a notoriously wretched pay-per-view. The next night on Raw, Austin and Rock met again, this time in a match that was even less of a match. That's because there was no match. After it was decided to have the on-screen version of Vince embrace being an authoritarian monster, this quasi-heel Vince ordered the anti-corporate Austin to defend his title against Rock yet again. At night's end, McMahon presided in-ring with the two rising stars to make sure a distrusting Austin actually defended his belt. This was a month after Montreal, mind you. Austin resisted giving McMahon what he wanted, practically daring his boss to fire him. Then, seizing the mic, Rock plainly stated, "Vince, The Rock thinks you should fire him," earning more than a few laughs for his deft comic touch. After that sampling of wit on Rock's part, the angle carried on with Austin forfeiting the belt to Rock, just to spite Vince. And with that, The Rock was the new WWF Intercontinental Champion. Then, Austin beat Rock up, knocked Vince off the apron, stole the belt back, and threw it off a bridge. You know, classic Austin. This freed Stone Cold up to pursue what was oh so clearly his destiny: the WWF Championship. Meanwhile, The Rock was Intercontinental Champion and quickly finding his voice as a pompous blue-chip athlete. The WWF that had long relied on the wrestling acumen of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels would start hitching its wagon to two larger-than-life personalities that 2 years earlier had either quietly washed out of WCW or quietly washed out of professional football. The game was about to change. As expected, 1998 began with the ascension of Stone Cold. Victory in the 1998 Royal Rumble match, last eliminating Rock, the match's endurance king, set up Austin to win the WWF title from Michaels at WrestleMania 14 in Boston. And the match came with a major subplot: the involvement of suspended boxing star Iron Mike Tyson, whom Austin clashed with in a heated row the night after the Rumble. The Austin-Tyson skirmish made headlines around the world and gave the WWF their biggest celebrity connection since the mid-80s. Austin captured the title from an ailing Michaels at WrestleMania, with a face-turned Tyson registering the 3 count himself. The attention garnered by Tyson's involvement helped WrestleMania 14 to the WWF's highest pay-per-view buy rate in 9 years, and solidified Austin's status as a bona fide star. Austin was now leading the charge, and his subsequent feud with full-blown heel McMahon gave Monday Night Raw its first ratings victory over WCW Nitro in nearly 2 years. The Austin-McMahon melodrama grew to include a cast of notable co-stars, not to mention an assortment of cars, trucks, and other vehicles being destroyed, just for the visual thrills. Such was the momentum of the Austin-led WWF that his match with The Undertaker at the 1998 SummerSlam made it the most bought SummerSlam in history. And while Austin continued cementing his legacy as the Hogan of this generation, The Rock continued making long strides towards singular greatness. The self-styled People's Champ outgrew his role as the nation's second banana, usurping Farouk's leadership the night after WrestleMania 14. By then, Rock had drowned out the faction's militant themes with his designer clothing, colorful turns of phrase, speaking in the third person, and a peculiar elbow drop preceded with silly theatrics. When Rock first started doing the People's Elbow, it was basically an inside joke meant to amuse his fellow wrestlers at house shows. When the move came to television, the elbow was initially met with near silence. But by the summer of 1998, fans were lapping it up. If it was an inside joke, the audience was now in on it. When Rock performed the People's Elbow on Triple H during their ladder match at that same 1998 SummerSlam, the 20,000 fans at the Garden responded uproariously. A month later, during the three-way cage match against Ken Shamrock and Mankind, Rock performed a double people's elbow that just about blew the roof off of Hamilton, Ontario's Cox Coliseum. Like Austin, Rock was a heel that was just too cool to stay heel. To the audience, Austin was the one, and The Rock was the next one. Rock's time came at the 1998 Survivor Series, albeit as the result of a heat-seeking callback. Following the vacation of the title, a carefully crafted 14-man tournament to crown a new WWF champion ended with an ostensibly heroic Rock defeating an oblivious Mankind in the finals. And he did so with the use of a sharpshooter and a McMahon-authorized clanging of the bell. The People's Champ was now the Corporate Champ, but the operative noun was champ. At 26, a year and a half removed from getting killed by crowds for his bland presentation, Dwayne Johnson was the top champion in the top company. The top star, however, was still Austin, who was screwed over late in the tournament through the usual McMahon chicanery. Even as far back as mid-November 1998, it was obvious what the main event of WrestleMania 15 was going to be. Though the path to actually booking the title match was anything but a straight line, Austin vs. Rock did headline WrestleMania 15 in Philadelphia. True to storybook norm, the good guy triumphed, netting Austin his third world title win in 365 days. More important than the predictable match result were the metrics. WrestleMania 15 set a new WWF pay-per-view high mark with 800,000 buys, obliterating a 10-year record. The over 20,000 fans in attendance accounted for $1.4 million at the gate. And it gets better. In the fiscal year that ended that April, the WWF set new records in both revenue, $251,474,000, and profit, $56,030,000. To demonstrate just how swiftly things turned around behind the Austin-led WWF, the company had only profited $8.4 million the previous year, and the year before that, they lost $6.5 million. The WWF ran an Austin Rock rematch 4 weeks later at the spiritual home of rematches, Backlash. There, a shade under 400,000 homes purchased the sequel, which was pretty high for a secondary pay-per-view. Shortly thereafter, on the merit of ungodly crowd response, Rock was turned back babyface, giving the WWF deck 2 strong aces instead of just 1. And establishing Rock as a clear good guy ended up paying off that autumn, when Austin was shelved long-term. Stone Cold needed spinal surgery and was gonna miss most of the year 2000. But instead of sagging in Austin's absence, the Attitude Party kept rollicking. With Rock as the clear leading man, the WWF continued trouncing WCW on Mondays, setting high marks on pay-per-view, and doing more big business. The fiscal year ending in April 2000 saw more record profits, as the WWF, which was by now publicly traded, reported a net gain of over $68 million. Along the way, The Rock bagged a couple more WWF championships and remained the unquestioned star of the show. While still the most electrifying man in sports entertainment, matches with Triple H, Kurt Angle, and Chris Benoit also showed that Rock had leveled up his in-ring game, at a time when the WWF's actual wrestling product had never been stronger. But while Rock the wrestler was maxing out, Rock the star was getting ready to shine brighter. In 2000, The Rock filmed scenes for The Mummy Returns as the villainous Scorpion King, and while Rock only received a small portion of screen time in the movie, his increasing fame was enough to warrant a starring role in a forthcoming spin-off. But before Rock's film career could really take off, he had business to tend to inside the ring. Austin returned from his spinal surgery in the autumn of 2000. Aside from a change of theme music, taking on the popular Disturbed cover of the Stone Cold Standard, this was pretty much the same Austin as before. He was still wildly popular, of course, but other than avenging an attempted vehicular homicide, this Austin really had nothing new to say. But who needs new? Renewing an old rivalry could be just as tempting, especially when there was a momentous stadium show just over the horizon. The WWF agreed. Late in a six-way world title match inside Hell in a Cell at December's Armageddon, Austin and Rock squared off, bloody face to bloody face. It was the two men's first in-match stare-down since Austin's comeback, and the fans in Birmingham, Alabama caught on to the significance. More than a month later, at the 2001 Royal Rumble in New Orleans, Austin and Rock were together during the final scene, and once more had a demonstrative showdown. For fans of a certain age, those whispery Fred Durst bars should be creeping into the brain right about now. With the WWF staging its first stadium WrestleMania in 9 years that April, they needed a big main event to fill the cavernous Houston Astrodome. And they had just the one. A crimson-soaked Austin managed to win the Rumble. And 5 weeks later, The Rock defeated Angle at No Way Out to win his 6th WWF Championship. In theory, this was the biggest WrestleMania main event since the days of Hulkamania. Two fully formed, genre-defining figures at or near the top of their game, facing off inside a baseball stadium before over 60,000 screaming fans for the consensus richest prize in the industry. Everybody knew Rock, and everybody knew Austin. But to Stone Cold's way of thinking, that was a bit of an issue. In Austin's comeback run, he felt that the Stone Cold character had lost its edge, that it was no longer a fresh piece of business. After all, how many times can a man guzzle beer, beat up suits, and menace bad guys behind the wheel of a large vehicle? Austin wanted to turn heel. He wanted to do something profoundly shocking to zap some life back into his character. But what would be the most shocking thing that Austin could do to turn heel? How about aligning with his sworn enemy? The weeks leading into WrestleMania featured immaculate build-up between champion and challenger. The passive-aggressive posturing, the attacks with each other's finishers, the sit-down interview with Jim Ross where both men laid out their cases for being the best. All of it perfectly soundtracked by Limp Bizkit's My Way. This was shaping up to be an unforgettable WrestleMania main event. Austin made that certain through some cryptic words in that sit-down. Speaking with a sobering dryness, Austin told Rock that he needed to beat him more than life itself. To read between the lines, this sounded like an aging headliner who knew that if his comeback bid fell a hair short, he would have been officially eclipsed by the younger star. Austin's faint desperation didn't resonate so much at the time, but the depth to those words rang loudly when the swerve of swerves commenced. WrestleMania X7 was already a Pantheon-level show by the time Austin and Rock kicked off their battle for the ages. With a reported 67,000-plus fans in Houston cheering madly in the event's fourth hour, Austin and Rock bloodied each other, smashed each other with weapons, and expertly teased humbling finishers, be they submission holds or stealing their opponent's maneuver. But as the tension grew, Vince McMahon randomly entered, making the long stride down the entrance ramp. Moments later, Austin asked Vince for a chair and got one. The next few minutes felt like a bizarre fever dream, as Austin and Vince worked in concert to keep the Rasputin-like Rock down after a hail of stunners and chair shots. After Austin pummeled Rock into mush with a desperate and sustained steel barrage, the champion didn't kick out. The initial pop for Austin's victory quickly gave way to the shock of seeing him shake hands with Vince before sharing a beer with him. Austin later admitted that while he wanted to turn heel and was in on this plan, he wished he'd called an audible late in the bout, because he believed he'd rekindled his lost mojo during the course of the title match. But instead of improvising a beating on Vince then and there, he and the boss left together in a confounding union. With 1,040,000 buys, WrestleMania X7 shattered the WWF's previous pay-per-view record, and the event accounted for $3.5 million at the box office. The company itself would have set another new record with an annual profit of nearly $85 million, but the near $70 million loss on the XFL disaster pissed on that parade. Nonetheless, on the wrestling side of things, the WWF appeared unassailably strong. WCW and ECW were dead, and WrestleMania was a head-spinning success. But instead of being a continuation of the Golden Age, WrestleMania marked the end of the Attitude Soiree. Rock went off for months after the event to film The Scorpion King, while Austin was now a bad guy, replacing his character's ballsiness with increasing paranoia and insecurity. And while the quality of Austin's matches was arguably never better than in this heel run, watching Stone Cold go move for move with the Benoits and Angles of the world wasn't what the masses were clamoring for. Raw's ratings began stagnating over the months ahead, failing to pick up much in the way of refugee WCW viewers. The invasion angles should have been the shot in the arm that the WWF needed, but that was a failure for countless reasons. Among them, Austin's disquieting and nonsensical leadership of the Revolutionaries. Aligning with Vince at WrestleMania was a bad idea, but that was miles better than Austin cowering at wife Deborah's cooking or turning "what" into an insipid catchphrase. The entire invasion stunk. And since Austin was at the forefront, his mojo was especially tarnished. The Rock returned from filming in the middle of the war, becoming de facto leader for the Federation allies. He and Austin were strategically kept apart over the months ahead until it was time to set up the winner-take-all match at Survivor Series. In the go-home week before the pay-per-view, Austin and Rock finally confronted each other in front of the cameras for the first time since WrestleMania weekend. Some of that previous magic was evident, even if they did engage in a bizarre karaoke duel. But it wasn't peak Rock versus peak Austin. This was the beginnings of part-time Rock facing off with an Austin that was just playing against type. We recognized the figures, but we didn't know these people the way we once did. Dismal Survivor Series ticket sales kinda reflected that feeling. The front page of Survivor Series was that the WCW-ECW faction was mercifully killed off, but there was perhaps a more interesting occurrence. The 5-on-5 Survivors bout that ended the war concluded with, for the first time ever, The Rock pinning Steve Austin. 4 years after Austin battled the Nation of Domination, and through many encounters since, this was the first time the People's Champion pinned Stone Cold in any way, shape, or form. Mind you, it wasn't a singles match, and Rock had help from double agent Kurt Angle, but a win is a win. From a kayfabe perspective, that ending sequence seemed to properly realign the universe, as within 24 hours, Vince was back to being the ruthless heel boss, and Austin was back to being babyface, simply by opposing now heel Vince once again. No earth-shattering developments, just a simplistic presentation to inform the audience of changes in character alignment. While Austin had wanted to turn heel earlier in the year, reversing course was absolutely necessary. Business fell off sharply with heel Austin on top, though not having Rock or any other well-built challengers to oppose him didn't really help either. The Austin character was inconsistent. Sometimes he was an anxious diva in need of coddling, other times he was the same badass he played in 1999, except he beat up the good guys now. and fans didn't want to watch this version of Austin. Months earlier, there were plans to run heel Austin versus babyface Triple H at WrestleMania X8, but with business down and his merchandise cut now much lighter, Austin was in a haste to turn again. Not that the golden age was jump-started by his doing so. Skits with Booker T were amusing, but were more standalone novelties rather than the beginning of a true Stone Cold rebirth. What became its own ridiculous craze, and Austin started, unfortunately, basing his promos around it. It wasn't a good sign when December's Vengeance pay-per-view, which strongly teased though didn't actually deliver the possibility of an Austin Rock match to unify the WWF and WCW world titles, did the WWF's lowest buy rate of 2001. While Austin made desperate changes, Rock basically stayed his course. He put over Chris Jericho several times in WWF title bouts while biding his time before his next movie project. Post-Attitude WWF crept into 2002, where Rock and Austin were met with an act that had hit the wrestling zeitgeist shortly before they did: the New World Order. WrestleMania X8 in Toronto would see Rock work with near 50-year-old Hulk Hogan, while Austin was paired with 43-year-old Scott Hall. While Rock and Hogan made undeniable magic together at the Sky Dome, Austin's match with Hall was kinda just there. Austin mostly got one over on Hall and the rest of the once unstoppable NWO in the weeks before WrestleMania, to mild interest at best from audiences. And the resulting match was a case of Austin putting the what in whatever. Post-Mania, Rock and Hogan were poised to form a short-lived super team, while Austin just up and went home. Dissatisfied with how things had gone for him creatively over the preceding months, especially his not wanting to work with a troubled Hall, the former six-time WWF champion walked out of the company, missing the following week's brand-splitting draft. When Austin did come back to Raw, it was more of the same. This time, Ric Flair stood in as the meddling boss for Austin to contend with, while the now rudderless NWO meandered in proximity. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff, even if the mission was to make Austin feel groundbreaking again. It didn't help that Austin was reportedly becoming very hard to work with, due to his resistance to change from the tried and true Stone Cold formula. Hey, such changes were costly in 2001, and the bottom line is Austin was looking out even harder for his bottom line. With Rock away doing promotional work for the Scorpion King, which would triple its $60 million budget at the box office, Austin was sputtering through rehashed angles. An attempt to form a horseman-like faction of Flair, Arn Anderson, Chris Benoit, and a returning Eddie Guerrero to give Austin some fresh opponents seemed to hold promise. Austin's match with Flair on the June 3rd Raw was arguably his best match since the dying days of the Invasion angle. But just as things were looking up for Austin and his portrayal, everything fell apart the following week. The plan for June 10th was to have Austin lose to newcomer Brock Lesnar in a King of the Ring qualifying match, after Flair and gang screwed Stone Cold over. This would have built to Austin versus Guerrero at the pay-per-view. Instead, Austin balked at the contest with Lesnar, feeling that it was too soon to run a match between he and the theoretical next big star, and throwing out their first encounter on free TV made even less business sense. While the office was originally able to talk Austin into the plan, he changed his mind the day of and booked a flight home. For the second time, Stone Cold walked out of the WWF. And this exit was going to be much uglier. 5 days after the walkout, Austin's wife Deborah Marshall called the police. claiming that Austin struck her several times during an argument. He was not immediately placed under arrest due to Deborah deciding not to press charges in the moment. That night, WWE Confidential did a tabloid-style story on Austin's walkout, with McMahon and Jim Ross offering scathing remarks on the subject of Austin's professionalism. News of the alleged domestic assault didn't break until late in the day Saturday and was not part of WWE's feature. 2 nights later, The Rock returned to WWE earlier than intended. With the Austin drama clogging both the wrestling and contemporary news mills, Rock took to the mic and essentially buried his peer, focusing mostly on Austin's hasty walkout. It was a pro-WWE speech, love the company or leave it, and if you leave good, we don't need you. While Rock was probably the most trusted name to give a rah-rah speech to the common fan, it's not like he was sticking around for the long haul. He worked the next 2 months, won the WWE title, dropped it to Lesnar in grand fashion at SummerSlam, and was then whisked away to film The Rundown. WWE in 2002 may have rolled out its future main event tentpoles in the shape of the OVW4, but in the short term, it was a weird place. Triple H and Undertaker went from Attitude Era supporting players to the veteran stars of opposite shows. But without the 2 biggest stars of the time, WWE just felt incomplete, and sagging ratings reflected a boom beginning to go bust. For the rest of his wrestling career, Dwayne Johnson never had a sustained run that stretched past 4 months. Austin, meanwhile, was in real limbo. The best version of Stone Cold was sorely missed, but that best version was absent long before the last walkout. And then there were the legal issues. That November, Austin pled no contest to the domestic assault charges from June. Per the plea agreement, Austin received 1 year of probation, a $1,000 fine, and had to undergo counseling. Austin's future in wrestling was very much in question. Given all that had transpired over the previous year and the combined weight of everything negative, it seemed like Stone Cold's book was closing. Shortly into 2003, however, Austin began mending fences with JR through a long phone call. After they got back on the same page, JR arranged for Austin to meet with Vince in Houston weeks later. As Austin recalls of the meeting, he ended up spilling his guts to Vince about the underlying cause of his pair of walkouts. While the unsatisfying creative pitches were straws that broke the camel's back, Austin claims his neck and back were worsening and that the reflexes in his legs were fading as well. He pushed himself through the early months of 2002, but found his body was becoming less cooperative. The physical toll of trying to carry on was equaled by a hefty mental toll. The fear that the game, his career, was over. Austin says he revealed this all to Vince when the boss began pitching a possible return to the ring. By this time, Austin had grudgingly made peace with retirement, but was willing to leave the door open for a proper send-off. He didn't want the walkout to be how it all ended, and how one of WWE's all-time biggest stars would be remembered. Austin wanted that theoretical last match to be with The Rock. JR claims that Austin was insistent that it only be The Rock, underscoring the respect Stone Cold had for his closest wrestling peer. After all, the only thing Rock hadn't achieved in wrestling was a one-on-one pinfall victory over Stone Cold. Coincidentally enough, Rock was already on his way back to the fold, but just like in 1997, not as the Rock that the audience was used to seeing. For the first time since 1999, Rock turned heel, leaning head-on into the role of a larger-than-life star that let fame go to his head. He even upgraded his music, entering to a pompous, shallowly divine cover of his signature theme. Some fans had already taken to booing the now part-time star, so Rock had fun with it, mocking the denizens of cities like Toronto and Sacramento with especially blistering remarks. On the night where this more antagonistic Rock defeated Hogan at the 2003 No Way Out, Austin returned to WWE for the first time in more than 8 months, pummeling former WCW boss Eric Bischoff in a truncated beatdown. A little more than a week later, WWE began setting the stage for Rock vs. Austin 3, the culmination of a storied WrestleMania trilogy. The setup was simple. A bitter Rock was annoyed with Austin winning Superstar of the Decade over him at the Raw 10th Anniversary Awards earlier in the year, and was still sour about never defeating Austin in any meaningful singles encounter, especially at Mania. The build wasn't particularly intense otherwise, as it melded Austin's greatest hits with Rock's new discourteous A-lister character. Limp Bizkit's Crack Addict soundtracked the build as a callback to 2 years earlier, but the era-defining intensity just wasn't there. As it turns out, the biggest drama surrounding the match came on its eve, away from the ring. The night before WrestleMania, McMahon and JR were summoned to a Seattle hospital, where they found a forlorn Austin laid up in a bed. He was feeling mostly fine when they got to him, but earlier in the day, Austin thought he was having a heart attack. He claims he overdid it with energy drinks, partially to power himself through the rigorous workouts needed to make his finale against The Rock a fitting one. But he was also battling panic attacks, anxious about not being perfect on the big stage. Austin had been a perfectionist his whole career, and he was scared that his final performance might fall beneath his own high standards. Austin knows this match will essentially bring 2 magnificent careers full circle. He just wants to hold up his end. He checked out of the hospital Sunday morning and met with Rock and Pat Patterson that afternoon to plan the all-important match. There, Austin instructed Rock to milk the final rock bottom to signify the end of Stone Cold. To further hint at the final curtain, Austin had the letters OMR stitched into his leather ring vest, standing for one more round. And that's how Austin felt when he entered second, following Rock's highfalutin trip down the crooked aisleway at Safeco Field. He was going to go out on his terms. What followed was 18 minutes of Austin giving a performance that he'd take great pride in. Rock took to his new shtick of elaborate clowning by donning Austin's vest while bringing the fight, only for Austin to duly battle back, doling out that rattlesnake justice. Customary for the two, the barrage of finisher attempts began. Rock hit a stunner, Austin fired back with his own, gaining a near fall. Austin avoided a people's elbow while Rock pushed out of another stunner. After a Rock spinebuster, Austin kicked out of a people's elbow, but not with the usual gusto. And then, the home stretch commenced. One rock bottom, Austin barely kicked out. A second rock bottom, which caused Austin to wriggle uncomfortably on the mat. Still, he barely kicked out. Then, Rock milked the moment for a long time, shifting in his attack crouch, waiting for an agonized Austin to pull himself to his feet. Usually, this sort of long setup gives way to a reversal, but there was no reversal to come. A dazed Austin simply walked into Rock's waiting grasp and stood there in acceptance of his fate. Rock took a few deep breaths amid the stillness, herked Austin up one more time, and then planted him with a third rock bottom. 3 seconds later, the trilogy was over. So too was Austin's wrestling career. In the denouement, Dwayne Johnson dropped the Rock facade and sat beside his pained friend. Johnson later revealed he'd said to Austin, "I thank you so much for everything that you've done for me. I love you." Austin responded that he loved him back. Rock then cleared out and gave Austin the stage to himself. Though not explicitly telegraphed as his retirement bout, Austin's exit spelled out the unsaid, as he left to his music and saluted the expansive crowd in his signature way from the stage. The Rock wasn't long for the WWE ring either. He'd stuck around for another month to lose to Bill Goldberg in The Man's first WWE match before splitting once more. A year later, Rock returned just long enough to be part of a couple of TV segments before teaming with Mick Foley to face Evolution at WrestleMania 20. And after that, Dwayne Johnson was done with the squared circle for the rest of the decade. By then, Austin was playing out the thinning string in a mostly mindless role as a counterpunch to Bischoff's evil bossing. It was a way to keep the stunners and beer bashers a thing without Austin having to actually wrestle, though that ran its course within a year. It's fair to say that everything after WrestleMania 19 was just bonus time for Austin and Rock. Everything they've given us since in WWE has been a tribute to what they cultivated and achieved between 1997 and 2003, when they discovered the best versions of their wrestling personas and reached their maximum potential within them. At the time of Austin Rock 3, we didn't grasp the importance. It was just another round instead of one more round to those living in the moment. Though Rock had a foot out the door pointed west and Austin didn't seem all that full-timey either, it just didn't seem like the end of an era. But it was. We'd gotten so used to the omnipresence of Austin and Rock over an entire era of WWE that even in their absences, their shadows still loomed large. Hell, retirements are so flimsy in wrestling that for all we knew, Austin was just one good prognosis away, and Rock was just 3 or 4 money-losing movies away from returning to the ring full-time. It's funny how things work out. Though Rock and Austin have both wrestled sparingly since, their clash in Seattle really is the perfect final chapter for both men. Here are 2 guys that in 1995 lost their dream jobs. Though both found themselves as part of pro wrestling's most enduring organization shortly thereafter, their initial forays there put them behind the 8 ball. The feisty Motormouth was a mute, and the cool jock was a grinning dork. Through persistence and a little assertiveness, they each eventually got to play highly caricatured versions of their true selves to public acclaim. And by doing things their way, they came to define an entire era of professional wrestling. So much so that they superseded the business as uncontrollable living legends. They both shared the ring with aging icons, rising stars, gifted athletes, and unforgettable personalities. But neither had a greater yin to their yang than the other. When you think of one, you invariably think of the other. So much had changed in the 7.5 years since the 2 men each found themselves at rock bottom. Since then, both men had experienced absurd direction, professional upgrades, pop culture relevance, dizzying heights, and for one of them, staggering lows. They've made indelible history together. Here, they were the pillars of a cherished time, colliding once more to write one last sacred page. The phrase end of an era gets thrown around quite a lot, but on March 30th, 2003, the era of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock ended inside the ring of their many triumphs. And it ended the only way it could, with one last fight done their way.